session. We're going to be presenting the posters outside. So the people who had their posters from the DC, please make sure to collect your posters to make those slots available. I have signs here with the numbers that have been associated with your posters. So the break before the poster session will be outside, helping you hanging the posters, and your slot will be there with the number that has been associated to your poster, and it's in the program. So, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you. All right, so the first paper for this session will be presented by Weima from Carnegie Mellon, and it is entitled An Interpretable Produce Price Forecasting System for Small and Marginal Farmers in India Using Collaborative Filtering and Adaptive Nearest Neighbors. I guess I just gave the presentation. Anyways, take it away.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for the long title and saying the long title so that I don't need to repeat. So I'm Weima, and I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University. And today I'm going to talk about the interpretable produce price forecasting system for the small and marginal farmers in India. And this is a joint work with George Chen. He's an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And we are also working with Kendall and Niraj. They are from Cool Crop, which is a startup. They are doing the cold storage system in India. And we also have Niraj in the room over there. And if you have any question about the on-site deployment and Cool Crop, he's more expertise than I. So let's start from the motivation. So we all know that agriculture plays a very important role in India. India is the second largest producer of the fruit and vegetables. And over half of the India population, they relies on the agriculture for the livelihood. But we observe that there are over 80% of India's agricultural populations are actually small and marginal farmers. So for those small and marginal farmers, they own agriculture land roughly the size of 2 football fields or less. And they don't have a full company to collect their harvest. So they need to bring their harvest to the local market and sell all this harvest themselves. But they often sell this harvest at a very undesirable low price. And we also observe that the fruits and vegetables, there's a huge fruit and vegetables wastage in India. There's roughly $6.6 billion loss in India due to the food wastage. So we claim that there are 2 key issues related to those problems. The first one is that there's a lack of cold storage system in the rural India area. So so there are many harvests that it spoils very quickly. So farmers, they have to crash sale before the spoilage, even the price is very low. And many companies, they are working on this issue. They create some solar powered cold storage system in small village. For example, the Eco Frost by the Eco Den and the Cold Shed by the Solar Cool. And we have witnessed enormous progress in this area. For example, in Odisha, 10 years ago, there's no cold storage system in that county. But like in 2014, we already have over 100 facilities in that area, and there are 0.3 million metric tons in that state. And actually, ourselves, we provide the affordable cold storage systems. And so we work with Cool Crop. We have the 5 metric ton outdoor refrigerator shared by the farmers. So we have 2 initial pilot projects in Dandeli and Kurtak, and there are 3 more 3 ongoing projects now. So we have in total 5 for now. So we have seen enormous progress have been made for the issue of lack of cold storage system. But the second issue have not been addressed. That is the lack of market forecast. So if the farmer, they want to use the cold storage system, they have to know if the price goes up or down after maybe 10 days or 1 month. So they need to make the decision whether they will sell these crops immediately or maybe store that for half a month and sell them later. So we have seen a lot of mobile applications. They provide the information platform for farmers. They have the real-time price information, but we haven't seen any application that gives a forecast of the future price. So that's what we want to look at in this project. So to conclude, we want to solve these 3 major problems in this project. First, we want to build a produce price forecasting system for over 1,000 markets in India. And the right figure is like the distribution of the market in India. And the most important thing is that we need to explain, interpret, and provide the evidence for the produce forecast. Because the farmers, they are not data scientists. We need to persuade them and give them the reason why we do the forecast like this, so that they can believe this prediction. And this also comes with a third question: how do we present the forecast results to the farmers? So to address these problems, first we look at the data we are using. So we use 2 sources of the data. The first one is ArcMarkNet, which is a website run by the India government's Ministry of Agriculture and the Farmers' Welfare. And so it archives like the historical pricing data for over 10 years, and it's a daily data, so it's very massive data there. And we also have the field survey data. The crew crops, they actually hire someone to collect the data locally. So in the following figure, you can see we plot the price for 6 crops and at 3 markets. You can see the spatial temporal patterns of the price are totally different for different crops at different markets. Even though for one crop, the price trend are similar, but there are still some variance between different markets. And we can also observe that there's a large amount of missing data. For example, the mango data. And we don't have any mango data on the ArcMarkNet webpage. But actually, there are transactions there. So it's just because the website they did not log in all this transaction. So to use this data, we build the forecasting method. In the forecasting method, we have 3 major components. The first one is imputation, and then we do the prediction, and lastly, we do the interpretation. So for the imputation part, since we observe that there's a large of missing data in the data set, so the imputation refers to the filling the missing data. We first formulate the price data as a matrix. So the row will be the different markets, and the column will be the different dates. For example, for markets, the first rectangle, the green rectangle represents the price data for the market 1 on day 1, and that data is available. But for the market 1, day 2, that data is actually missing. And we view this red rectangle as a data matrix, and you can think of this data. This data matrix is sparse, and there are some missing value there. And we formulate this problem as the imputation problem as a collaborative filtering problem, also known as a matrix completion. The matrix completion is widely used in the image processing. For example, in this, so we have the original image, and if we only observe part of the data, like the second figure, and we put that to the collaborative filtering method, then we can recover the image. And we apply the same method to our data matrix. So before the imputation, we can say there's a lot of missing data before 2007. But after the imputation, we can say this imputation recovers basically the spatial and the temporal trend of all the onion price. And having the complete price matrix, we then formulate a problem to predict the price change direction. We want to know whether the price will go up, go down, or stay the same. So we formulate this as a classification problem. And so in this figure, we can see we want to predict the price trend on day 7. So we use the price before day 7 as the feature vectors. And we put this feature vector into the adaptive nearest neighbor method. The reason we use this method is that we can actually do the interpretation by exploring the nearest neighbors. Okay, and then we do the interpretation. So the adaptive nearest neighbor method actually is a very large family of methods that are the interpretable machine learning method. It includes the decision trees and bagged decision trees, for example, the random forest, and also the boosted decision trees, for example, the gradient boosting and ADA boosting. So if we use any of this method, we can, after we train the model, we can actually learn a similarity function between the new feature vector and the training data. Let's say we want to predict the price for today, and we formulate a new feature vector x, and then we put that into the algorithm. Then the algorithm can find the k training points that are closest to x, and this k training points they actually act as a forecast evidence. And the most important thing is that we know the exact market and the exact date of those forecast evidence. So after we finish all this, we can tell farmers that current forecast, for example, today's forecasts are based on the price trend 10 days ago, or today's forecasts are based on the very similar trends on another market 3 days ago. So something like this. And there's also some other issues in the forecast method. For example, we also use the volume data, which is the number, the number of transactions in that field. And also we do the time quantization, which we can use to predict the price trend for next 1 month or next 2 weeks. And we use the heuristic method using the forecast evidence to predict the exact price and also the price uncertainty intervals. So to give you a rough idea of the accuracy, first, if we want to forecast the price change directions, so if we only want to know if the price will go up, go down, or stay the same, we can achieve roughly 70% or 60% accuracy. But if we want to forecast the exact price, the error is roughly 10 rupees per kilogram. This is actually pretty large because the average price for those produce is 30 rupees per kilogram. And we also develop a web application, so to let farmers know what's the prediction results for today, and we update this web page every day. And this is an ongoing pilot project, so we don't have any quantitative measurement of how useful is this for farmers, and if farmers think the information we provide are very useful. But we give them they can choose the market and the crops they want to look at, and we give them the prediction for next 7 days, next 2 weeks, and next 1 month. And also we give them the interpretation. So those green trends are the nearest neighbors for the current price, and they can check if the interpretation looks good and if they are confident about this forecast. And we also give them the historical price trend for this market for this crop at this market. And so for the future research, we want to further improve the forecasting accuracy. For example, we want to incorporate other sources of information. For example, there's a paper in KDD last year, 2 years ago, sorry. It's about tax analysis of new articles. They analyze the economic articles in India, and they put this into the feature vector. And also, we are exploring the better imputation and forecasting method. For example, the blind regression. We actually achieve better accuracy by using the blind regression, but that algorithm is very complex and it takes more time, so we didn't use that in the actual deployment. And since it's an ongoing project, so I want to conclude with some open questions. The first one is, what kind of marketing analytical information are actually useful for farmers? And the second question is, what is the best way to present the marketing analytic insight to farmers? Because now we are using the web applications, and we make that portable for the cell phones. But we also see some papers that are using the text message to farmers. But there are also some arguments saying that the text message doesn't work at all or something like that. So that's basically a question we need to think about. And another very general question is that how do the market information impact the farmer's behavior, income, and agricultural supply chain? For example, if more and more farmers are using this system, then their behavior will change the price. And what happens if more farmers are using this system? Do our forecasting system still work at that time? So we need to think about that. Yeah. So that's basically my presentation, and we have the contact information for all of us. If you are interested, you can feel free to contact us. Thank you.
All right, questions?
You got it.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I had a question about if you handled different commodities differently. So for example, probably, I'm just using my household knowledge here, probably there is not much variation in terms of the kinds of tomatoes that you can get in the Indian markets, but probably mango is a lot more differentiated crop. So, the price of an Alfonso mango will be very different from a price of, I don't know which one, say the Pyrie mango in Mumbai. They will be like quite different prices. And then within that, the price of the Alfonso mango from Ratnagiri will be very different from the price of the Alfonso mango from Valsad. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is a huge, substantial difference in prices of different kinds of commodities. So there's nothing like an average price of mango, basically. In comparison, tomato may be just a flat price. So do you differentiate at that level, and does it affect your work?
Yes. So first of all, we are doing different, each produce separately. That's one thing, and we train the model for each produce separately. And for different markets, we are using some method to identify the closest market, and we train the model for the closest markets together. For example, the market in Mumbai and Kurtak, we train the separate model for them, and we are using different data. And if that data is good enough, we can identify the difference. That's all I can say for now, because I didn't look at this spatial or geographical difference intentionally, but we are aware of that, and we are actually training different models for that.
We have time for one more question. Okay, good. Thank you, Weimar.
Thank you.
All right, so for our next paper, we have Alain Sciamma from Syracuse presenting his paper on effective credit scoring using limited mobile phone data.
Gotcha. How long is the entire presentation? Yes, yes. Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah. Oh, good. Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Alan Shema, and I'm from the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. I'll start with a question. How many people have heard of mobile money? For example, M-Pesa. Okay, so speaking to the choir here. So the way mobile money started, for people who don't know, it's the idea that you could send money through your mobile phone from one place to another, from one user to another. So the idea was for people like young people move to urban cities, they could transfer money cheaply to their parents back in the villages. So that's how the idea started. And then it's moved from there to adding merchants on the platform. So for example, instead of just transferring money between two users, you could now buy goods and services and pay your bills through mobile money. And from there, it's went to accepting deposits. So instead of just putting money, transfer, cash out, you could put money in there and leave it on your account and it would bear interest. And quickly from there, it moved into issuing loans to people. So so this study here is looking at creating credit scores for people who try to borrow mobile money using limited mobile phone data. So what's the motivation here? There's been an explosion of loans that are being issued through mobile money. For example, in 2017, just last year, 11 million microcredits had been issued out in East Africa. So for example, and then in a fifth of people using, 20% of people using mobile phones in Tanzania have borrowed money using their phone. In Kenya, there is now more borrowers through digital through mobile phones than there are borrowers going to traditional financial institutions, including microfinance. So there's clearly a big trend here where there's an increasing number of people borrowing money through, these are microloans through mobile phones. Now, the risk that this poses is contrary to microfinance, the traditional microfinance, where a person goes to the institution and there's a credit officer who knows the person and can assess their needs and whether they'll pay back. This is completely done through mobile phones and it's completely automated. There's nobody, you don't go to anyone, nobody, it's even difficult to recover the money because these are done through mobile phones and you don't know where the person lives or whatever they do. So this has led into a high number of credits of people defaulting on their loans. As an example, in Tanzania, they're saying 30% of people borrow through mobile phones do not pay back their loans, and 50% of the rest do, when they pay back, they do pay late. So there's clearly a need for better assessing credit risk for borrowers. Now, however, the way it's currently done is that it poses a lot of risk to people. So I'll just go through a few ways that digital lenders are using to score people. The first way is by collecting, some lenders collect data through social media. So what you do is before you ask for a loan, they'll ask you for your credentials to your platform, to your Facebook, your Twitter, your Gmail, all of that. And what they'll do is that they'll go fetch all that data to try and identify you and understand any risk that could be associated with that. An example of this is called Lendo, which has a credit profile risk that's basically done on using social media. Now, I don't need to tell you the risk of using social media data, as most of you might probably have heard about analytica and influencing people to make other types of decisions by mining their social media profiles. And even more risky is that some lenders use that to shame people who are not paying back. So once you've already given them your credentials, what they'll do is if you do not pay back your loan, they'll post it on your Facebook wall or on Twitter saying, this person did not pay back their loan. So that's one way of they're trying to use to deter people from not paying back. But obviously, that's not what most people would like. Imagine if every time you did not pay back your credit cards, the bank informed all your friends that you're not paying back. Now, the next type of lenders, what they use is they use an application. So you download an app before you could borrow on your phone, And what the app does is it fetches all sorts of data from your phone directly. So this is an example of a lender called Tala. When you're installing it on Android, you see all the permissions that it needs. Among others, it reads your SMS content, it reads your contacts, it reads who you call, where you get calls from, it gets your locations and all that stuff. And we can see that a lot of this data might help the financial lender to know you better, but they pose a lot of other risks which are not, they get more information than just your financial capabilities. So for example, when you're reading my SMS content, then you even know what I'm talking to with friends, and that's, I would argue, has nothing to do with my ability to pay back. Lastly, the other type of lenders, what they do is they work with telecom companies. And so the telecommunication companies, what they do, they avail to the lender your history of your calls and your recharges and all that. And what the lender will do is that they'll mine that data to understand you better. Now, so going from this, what we're trying to do is trying to see, okay, there's clearly a need to better assess the risk of borrowers, but at the same time, you do not want to go beyond just assessing risk by fetching all this data. So working with a lender of airtime. Now, we do not work with mobile money, we work with top-ups. So people would top up. How many people know about recharges and top-ups and airtime? Everybody? Yeah, good. So in this lender, what they do is they, if you run out of airtime and you cannot access the nearest shop to buy a recharge voucher, you could quickly borrow from them and they'll lend you the airtime. So they work in a country, this study was set in a Central African country, and from the telecommunication company, we got about 150 million records that were generated by 3 million subscribers. Now, I want to emphasize that these records only contain recharges. So it's basically saying person X, in fact, they're anonymized identifiers. So an anonymous user on Friday at 9 in the morning, they topped up 50 rupees on their mobile phone. That's it. They do not say who you're calling, when you're calling people, and all that stuff. It's just basically saying what's your recharge history. And then from the lender, we also got a data set which has about 40 million loans that were issued to 1.7 million customers out of those 3 million from the telecommunication company. And this data covered the period from April last year, from April 2017 to March 2018. All right. So it basically was what we did is we're trying to see, okay, each of these data sets, how much power do they have in predicting whether a person will pay back their airtime loan? So we used the two data sets separately and also in combination. So we have the recharge data set, the loan data set, and then we combine both of them, do some model training with a random forest, and then we get the models. Now, how do we validate our prediction? What's currently happening is that the lender has their own way of accessing customers. So because of that, that means the loan data itself is already biased in a way, because it only shows the people that the lender was decided to lend to by after assessing that they were worthwhile, they could pay back. Now, to properly assess our model, what we did is, with the lender, we conducted a random experiment where we selected 125,000 numbers who had done at least one recharge in the last 6 months, and we separated them into 5 groups, which is how the lender does. So we selected randomly numbers, and then we let them borrow. So that's to remove that bias of saying these people were already selected before. And then what we did, now we use our models that we pre-trained on the data that I explained in the previous slides, and we try to validate it on the currents on those randomly selected numbers. As you can see, the recharge, when you're only using features from the recharge dataset, the recharge dataset is very good at telling you the highest number of people who are able to pay back. So the sensitivity here means basically, out of all the people that's paid back our loans, how many were we able to select from that group? The loan data on the other side is very conservative because it knows how many people have been defaulting, and so it's looking at the characteristics of people who default, and so it becomes a bit more conservative when selecting people to lend to. However, because of that, it leads to a higher precision, which means we get low number of people who are actually defaulting. So once we decide that person X will pay back, they actually have a higher chance of paying back when you're using the loan data, whereas the recharge data is a bit much lower. And then when we combine the two of them, you get a better area under the curve, which is a good compromise of both the sensitivity and the precision. Now, after doing that, we wanted to say, okay, so now we have these models, we've proven that they seem to be working. What we need to do now is actually use it, sorry about that, actually use it on real customers. So what we did is, again, working with the lender, we separated the markets into 25% and 75%. 75% of the market was assessed by the lender's current system, and 25% of the market was assessed by our new proposed methods. And what you see there is the current credit scoring system, which is what the lender is using, and our new proposed method. And across the board, you can see that the new method is performing much better. However, because we consistently decreased the default rates, but the problem was also we reduced the number of people who were able to borrow, and we reduced that by about 20%. So then the lender said, okay, less people are defaulting, but at the same time I'm lending out less. So that means I'm also making less profits on the amounts that I'm lending. So what's now the next work is to see how do we increase the number of people who are able to borrow, but at the same time keep the default rates low. I seem to be breaking everything around here. So one of the ways would be, for example, exploring how do you, when people want to borrow, even if your system says is not going to be able to pay back, how do you give them, you can select randomly people and put them give them the smallest amount possible and see how they pay back. And then using the history, you can gradually put them on a higher amount. Now, from our external validation, we observed a number of things. So when we did our credit scoring, people from the old systems, a number of them were able to gain access to more money, just like another number was, had their credit limits lowered. Now, from our 26, the number of people who had increased credit limits quickly borrowed more. So which means when you increase the credit limit of somebody, it seems to incentivize them to borrow more. But at the same time, they tend to default also more. So by increasing the credit limits, you almost incentivizing people to borrow more than they can pay back. And so we're also trying to see, as a future work, is to see what's leading people to do this. One of the ways previous literature says is that people tend to estimate their future earning based on their credit limit. So if my people use credit cards. If my credit card says I can borrow up to $1,000, then in my head I assume that I'm worth $1,000. That means that I can make $1,000 in the future, even though I'm possibly not going to do that. So that can lead to over borrowing, and so we are thinking of how to investigate this even more. Now, there's a number of limitations to our study. For example, the first thing is we were looking at only airtime recharges. We're not looking at other types of recharges. And this, the payments were done automatically, meaning for the customers to pay back, they only had to top up their phone, and then out of that, their loans will be deducted. So it will be interesting to see when people actually have to actively pay back, if that's sort of influences the payment rate. And also, we do not have, our products here do not have any interest rate. It's only had a fixed service fee of 10%. So whether you pay today or 10 days later, you only had to pay 10%. It wasn't an accumulative interest rate. So to conclude, current credit scoring poses certain risks to the borrowers, as we saw before, but our study shows that we can build effective credit score by using limited data without needing to know much more than necessary. There's still a lot of research to be done in this area because we're only looking at airtime borrowing. And finally, as we're using data from telecommunication companies, we can imagine in developing countries where credit bureaus seem to be less effective because people don't use, most people do not have their financial history stored somewhere in a credit bureau. We can imagine telecommunication companies in the future acting as credit bureaus because they have all this data from so many people, and that data seems to be impressive at deciding default rates. And I'll conclude by that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With actually lots of similar issues in India. One question we have here is how do you square this with multiple people using the same phone if you map everything to the same subscription number? Is there anything, like, is the credit score is for that mobile phone number, but that may not be used always by the same person. How do they deal with that?
So it's true that there is, especially like back in the countries that I'm looking at, there's a lot of phone sharing. So people tend to use one phone, especially in the household. Like the husband will own the phone and the wife would use it every now and then. But the other thing that we also observe is that people tend to buy SIM cards instead of buying phones. So SIM cards have become so cheap, they're even distributed freely to people sometimes. So what people will do is, if I cannot afford a phone, what I'll do, I'll get a SIM card, and then I'll ask my neighbor for the phone, put my SIM card in, and make a call, and so that I don't use the airtime. And so, because our scoring is done on the phone numbers, that's already also covers those people who do not have phones, but they have SIM cards. And it's true that there's still people sharing phones. We don't have a way of dealing with that yet.
You were here. Yeah, great talk, thank you. I had a question about when you said that you gave 20% less loans on your experiment that you tried, but don't you have a continuous score that you get from your model that you could tweak to achieve a specific sensitivity and then just evaluate? So even in the results, you reported one number for sensitivity and one number for precision, but I imagine you would have a whole curve for it because your random forest is outputting a continuous score of whether this, or maybe I understood it incorrectly.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So when you reported the performance of your credit scoring thing, you reported a AU ROC and you reported one number for the sensitivity and one number for the precision. But usually you would have an entire range and you can choose where your algorithm should be in terms of sensitivity and precision, right? Or maybe
yes, you would choose that, but that is after the fact. So this, remember, this was an experiment where we just opened the floodgates to everybody, to a certain number of people to borrow. Yeah. So we did not do any scoring prior to them borrowing. We just let them borrow, and then from that data set, we're trying to validate and see, okay, if we'd done scoring before, how many people would have paid back, and also how many people of those who paid back would we have selected, if that makes sense. So that gives you an idea of, first gives you an idea of how much potential revenue am I losing by not extending loans, and also when I extend loans, how much money am I going to lose by people not paying back. That's.
So I have one question. You mentioned that in the new credit scoring system that you introduced, there were less borrowers. So people who were borrowing, or the number of people who were borrowing was getting less. Why was that? What factors were at play in those cases?
So I think what's happening is that first of all, when we're training our system, we're training it on data that was of people who were already selected by the lender before. So they've already done their own scoring on that number, and on those numbers, that's we're able to borrow. And so when you do that, that means if the lender was already lending to 100 people that they selected out of 200 people, now I'm only scoring using data from that 100 people, I'm going to select an even less number from that. You see what I mean? Because I'm going to reduce even the number of people are defaulting from that 100. And so that's how you end up with less. So what we are trying to do now is try to, by running like the experiments before, but those experiments are very costly because when you select a number of people and say, okay, I'm going to give you loans without looking at your risk, that means a lot of people are also going to default. So what we're trying to do is trying to say, okay, how do we select slowly a few numbers, more and more numbers, increasing numbers, letting them borrow, and so that they decide their own fate as opposed to being having it predefined by the system.
So it was the lenders who were not giving out loans, right? Not the borrowers deciding not to take loans.
No, it's the lender who is deciding. So I decide you're not going to be able to borrow. So that stops you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alan. So, yes. So we're going to have now Kartik Krishnan from University of Michigan presenting his paper on cashing out, digital payments, and resilience post-demonetization.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to present our work on digital payment adoption during demonetization. This is joint work with Professor Aditya Jodi, Professor Joyjit Pal, and Ram Gopal from University of Michigan. Broadly, when you look at development literature, we're essentially looking at, or more specifically development economics literature, you're kind of looking at papers in the realm of measuring efficiency and or measuring effectiveness. So measuring efficiency would mean like how much something is changing, and measuring effectiveness would be like how well things are or what's happening, right? So measuring, understanding what's happening. Similarly, if you slice this entire literature from the perspective of what the context we are studying, we are essentially studying either normal times or crisis times, right? So this paper, Cashing Out, kind of falls squarely in the effectiveness and crisis times bucket, and I'm specifying this primarily because the findings and the objectives of our research are essentially based on that. So when we are talking of crisis times, or when we are talking of studying an external shock, we are essentially interested in first understanding what the shock was, and this is a shock which probably everyone who was in India at this time kind of faced and who still remembers. It's November 8, 2016, and at 8 p.m. on national television, Prime Minister announces that 86% of the cash in the economy is now no longer going to be legal tender. So essentially, all this cash has been sucked out of the economy, and the consequences for citizens was citizens had X number of days to kind of convert their old notes that they had into new notes. There was a severe cash crunch, and there was limited supply in the banks and the ATMs, right? However, the government's stated objectives were initially three: curb black money, stifle terror funding, and cut back on counterfeit bills. However, over the period of time, they did add a few more objectives, like formalizing the economy, reducing cash dependence, and promoting digital payments. This aspect of promoting digital payments is what interested us in studying this event and trying to understand how people behaved during this time to kind of reduce the impact of the shock on their own livelihoods. On the right, I also have this pretty recent quote from Arvind Subramaniam, who is the ex-chief economic advisor. And he basically said this was a draconian shock, which is good for us because we are studying a shock, and it's kind of widely recognized to be a big enough shock to have an effect on people and their livelihoods. And more importantly, he also says about demonetization that it was presupposed to that the people, the vulnerable people in the Indian economy who depended primarily on informal sector livelihood and on cash had extraordinary amount of resilience. And while this was recently stated, this exactly these areas that we wanted to target in our research when we started about more than a year ago. However, though demonetization has this polarizing effect in terms of whom you're talking to, whether it was good or bad, fortunately we do not have to take sides because we are just looking at demonetization as an event and trying to study how people adopted to this shock or people manage this shock in terms of their livelihoods and incomes. So we are essentially motivating this research from the perspective of how people explore technology adoption as a behavior change mechanism in such not so normal times. And we are essentially interested in studying the resilience of all those who are affected by this shock. In order to do that, we also attempt a definition of resilience for this context. And we basically focus on rural livelihoods. Both rural and livelihoods are important in this context because much of the literature on demonetization has been focused on urban centers and on consumers. So this study is kind of unique in the sense that it looks at rural livelihoods which were dependent on cash and provides policy prescriptions for practitioners and policymakers. So again, why is this important from a theoretical perspective is that much of the crisis and resilience literature studies, it's very broad and it studies a lot of things from climate change to financial and economic shocks to shocks in organizations, etc. However, when we look at technology adoption and crisis and resilience, there seems to be very little intersection in terms of studies that look at this, and much of the technology adoption literature focuses on technology adoption models, and a few of them talk about digital natives versus digital refugees, etc. in the context of technology adoption. However, we believe that these technology adoption models might not be sufficient to study technology adoption in times of a shock, because there the drivers of why people would adopt a technology and use it are probably slightly different than adopting a technology by just looking at its perceived benefits and the ease of use. Hence, we look at the social mobilization and behavior change literature, and we kind of inherit some kind of a behavior change framework from that to study technology adoption and relate it back to crisis and defining resilience. So before I jump into the research study itself, there were two building blocks that we kind of used for our research. One is trying to define resilience from the perspective of this shock, and while much of the resilience literature talks about adaptation and adoption, we kind of use a similar language but define it specific to this study, which is the extent to which an individual is able to, during the crisis, adopt a particular technology alternative or adapt to the low cash situation in order to minimize the impact on their average livelihood income. And that's how we kind of define resilience in this context. The second thing, second building block is the social mobilization and behavior change framework that we inherit from the public health and broader development literature. Much of the behavior change models are either diffusion models, which are top-down, or community-based models, but we needed a process perspective in terms of the mechanism of change, and hence we kind of looked at this layered approach to behavior change, which says that a person undergoing this process of change should basically be first knowledgeable about the new behavior and its benefits, then also have access to the right infrastructure in order to undertake that change, should be incentivized to take action. Some might have infrastructure, or the infrastructure might be freely given to them, but they might not have the incentives to take action, so you need to incentivize that. And for continuous use, you need to kind of have a favorable cost benefit kind of a situation for them to continuously use the technology or use that new behavior. So we are going to use this basic model. There are variations to this model which have come up in the last 10-15 years. This one is a basic model which was defined in 1997, and we believe for the purposes of inheriting this into our context, this basic model kind of suffices. So we studied demonetization 180 days after the event, and that itself was a question for us as to whether we would be able to do this. And just like we have certain life events that kind of we remember as if they happened yesterday. A lot of people whom we studied kind of remembered what happened during the period of demonetization like it was yesterday. So that kind of, the pilot kind of helped us believe that we could still collect data 180 days down. The timeline is basically, we had there's a pre-demonetization period. Demonetization happened on November 8th. Post-demonetization period was, the period of interest was essentially the 1 month post-demonetization. In terms of recovery, we kind of looked at how people recovered from the shock 6 months down the line as well as we were talking to them. Broadly, we use recall-based surveys. Much of the individual attributes we collected were specifically pre-demonetization in terms of whether they had access to mobile phones or bank accounts, etc. The period immediately after demonetization and the recovery period is essentially looking at the impact on their livelihoods. And as I said, we use recall-based surveys. This survey was conducted primarily in Tamil Nadu in two cities and 2 villages. The villages were selected based on the Digital Village initiative, because we needed to go into a village where there was some level of awareness of digital payments because of the nature of our study. And the 2 cities were again randomly selected to kind of aid in comparison. Tamil Nadu was chosen because it's a politically neutral state between the BJP and the Congress, and we felt that the political biases would kind of be underplayed to some extent. In terms of our analysis, we did a 2-stage analysis. The primary parameter of interest was perceived impact on income and volume of transaction, and we look at it from the perspective as a function of awareness, access, and action related to digital payments. However, awareness, access, and action kind of do not help policymakers design programs, because it's difficult to identify people with high awareness or high access, etc. So we kind of then broke down in stage 2 each of those behavior traits and studied them from the perspective of basic hard demographic factors. Also, it's important to mention here that we use perceived impact on livelihoods and perceived impact on income and transaction, because we are doing a recall-based survey, and it's obviously the responses are going to be biased by what each individual faced, the struggles they faced during that time. So measuring hard income effects in a recall-based survey is tricky. But also from the perspective of studying resilience, resilience is both a factor of the psychological factors that people undergo at the time of crisis, as well as the hard monetary impact that it might have on their livelihood. So from that perspective, using a subjective well-being measure of resilience kind of helped in covering the entire gamut of factors that could drive resilience. In terms of findings, broadly we had 4 important key findings. There was significant rural-urban divide. Rural poor were much better than urban poor. Primarily, the mechanism driving this was there was lower heterogeneity in terms of the kind of people and digital payment adoption, etc. in rural areas. And rural people were essentially using an adaptation kind of an mechanism where there were lots of kind of barter deals in the sense that I'll give you medicine, you give me vegetables, or I'll pay you for vegetables for a week and stuff like that. So there was this social support system, and everybody was homogeneous in the sense that in terms of their level of adoption, etc. In the urban area, obviously, in the urban area, there was higher heterogeneity, and this kind of led to a big loss in livelihood for people who are not able to adopt to digital payments. And the second important thing was that when higher the dependence on cash, greater was the impact on the livelihood, and people who knew how to use digital payments prior to demonetization were better off during the crisis. And the fourth most important thing was that people who had access to bank accounts were much more affected than even people who didn't have access to bank accounts. This was surprising because in the normal times, you believe that if you have access to infrastructure, you're kind of better off in the entire scheme of things. But in the case of the crisis, the banking access kind of resulted in money being stuck in the banks, and kind of people who were forced to open bank accounts and put their money into bank accounts didn't know how to use alternate methods of withdrawing that cash, and it was actually, they were much worse affected than even people who didn't have bank accounts. So there was a slight, we didn't have enough power in terms of gender, but we did find certain important findings which are there in our paper. I'll skip in because of paucity of time. Key takeaways, we had urban distress and rural resilience, and we found that access is no panacea to resilience. And from a key policy implication perspective, we believe that to build resilience, you need to ensure that there is an ability to switch behaviors, and we need to look at not just technology adoption, but technology use, and think of it as a behavior change process rather than just an access-driven infrastructure process. And we believe also that this has broader implications than just technology and digital payments, because even if you look at things like toilet adoption, just giving infrastructure is not enough. The entire behavior change process is important to help drive development outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one question. A quick one. All right.
Just in terms of the terminology used, you called demonetization a shock. So shock doesn't have, too many positive aspects, but you try to remain neutral, you said.
I'm not able to.
So I was concerned about, you called
without the mic, I'm not able to hear. Yeah.
You called demonetization a shock. So shock doesn't have too many positives associated with it, right? So you try to remain neutral, you said. So shock is generally negative.
So shock could be both a positive shock and a negative shock. But demonetization was, in our perspective, a negative shock because it affected all the people who we surveyed. Their incomes only fell, and hence, from this perspective, it would be a negative shock. What I said was like, in terms of the political discussion on whether it's good or bad, we are not taking a stance on demonetization, but just using demonetization as an event to study how people adopted to that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right, now we're going to have Rajesh presenting his paper that was published in the Economic and Political Weekly this year. It's entitled, "Are Technology-Enabled Cash Transfers Really Direct?"
You escaped pronouncing my last name. That's a good move. No. So my name is Rajesh Veeraraghavan. I am an assistant professor at Georgetown University. So as he was mentioning that this paper was already published at the EPW, the Economic and Political Weekly, which is it's an academic journal, but it's also a policy journal. So this work is this paper is more on the policy side. So keep that in mind. And this is work which is with Vivek Srinivasan, who is supposed to be here, who's leading this project. It's actually an action-oriented research project. I also want to call out Dipanjan Chakraborty, who is here from Gramwani. IIT Delhi is his past. And as I said, this is a project that is continuing, and we are actually looking for volunteer coders. So if you're interested in helping out, please get in touch with me. So that's why the URL is there. So the context for this work is focused on tracking government to citizen payments for welfare. So this is in contrast to the paper that we just heard about of shocks, that happens once in a while. These are everyday shocks for the poor who are, dealing with a very simple issue of trying to get payments for the work they do. And I was almost tempted to kind of ask this question, or make a comment saying the resilience for these systems are built in because they suffer day to day to get these cash transfers, right? So in that sense, I think that external shock, while it's great, but a lot of the poor actually are suffering so much to get basic entitlements for work they've already do. And this project tries to examine that question. So the real problem is how do the state reliably deliver cash for services or entitlements to workers on poor at scale? So these are things that they're supposed to receive as payments. Think of your salary that you work for a day and you don't get payments. So these are very, very simple needs, but at scale this seems to be a huge problem. And it's a non-trivial problem in a country like India, with the ability for the state to do this have not been good. So there are like 120 development programs after independence, and still we are basically unable to solve this basic problem of delivering payments. And we have this quote with Rajiv Gandhi. I don't know whether that's true, but it basically repeats this slogan that only a fraction of 10% of the money actually reaches the intended recipients. And the payments, there are a lot of problems. These are just the delay payments, fudging records, fake names, and the problems are typically identified with the lower level bureaucrats and intermediaries. And the solution that has been proposed is to see whether we can do direct cash transfers and eliminate intermediaries through the use of digital technology. I mean, that's the kind of promise, and it has actually a global relevance too. Now with artificial intelligence coming in, there's a greater kind of need for figuring out how do we deliver payments to everybody, right? And the hope is that you can actually use technology to bypass all these intermediaries and get money to them directly. And New York Times looks at the case that I'm going to examine and basically says that India eliminated a raft of bureaucratic middlemen by depositing government pension and scholarship payments directly into bank accounts for beneficiaries in a bid to prevent corrupt state and local officials from diverting much of the money to their own pockets. Some officials and economists see this as direct payments as revolutionary. And this is shared locally too. The idea that the poor can swipe a card, like we all have a debit card, and equating availability of debit cards with ending financial untouchability. So the broad claims that we examine in this paper, we want to just briefly touch on, is that intermediaries are susceptible to bribery and fraud. So we replace that with digital transfers, and it has like these 4 claims. One is digital transfers would be instantaneous. It eliminates intermediaries. Technology also could ensure full transparency. Sylvia here presented a paper last year on this very question, examining whether technology does provide transparency and how does it work. And I'm not going to mention this last reason. Ritika Khera, who briefly was there attending this talk, was talking about, I've done a lot of work on how cash transfers is used to, there's an ideological argument about eliminating any public services and replace them by cash. So this question of figuring out a way to kind of deliver direct cash transfers have a lot of motivations, both ideological and also for efficiency reasons. The method was really hard to really kind of spell out, because this is an active action research project, and we took a slice of this work to publish in this policy work, and this was one of the team members spent 8 months living in one mandal, which is a sub district, and we also recruited a bunch of volunteers to live in the village, and we also did data analysis from whatever data is available in the open data websites. And I also should kind of warn about this study. This is a negative case study, because there is actually a study that was done, an RCT, a randomized control trial that was done on this project, and my own dissertation work was on it, which actually have a very different prediction than what I'm going to say here. And this is the main point of this presentation, or this highlighting these claims, is to contrast the dominant narrative. So this is from a mandal, or from a sub-district, and we're finding a lot of facts about the claims of this particular idea of direct cash transfer. So it is not an evaluation of this particular program. So I just want to make sure that when you're thinking about this, we're not anti-technology, we're not anti-cash transfers, but this is just to contrast this dominant narrative that direct cash transfers would eliminate all of these things. So the first claim that I want to examine is this idea that these cash transfers are about eliminating intermediaries, right? And if you look at the institutional arrangements that are put in place for the payment system, and whether with Aadhaar or not, there was a number of steps before reaching the poor. Usually the image of what you see is the poor goes to a point of service terminal at the end. They have a thumbprint with or without Aadhaar, and they get cash, and that's the kind of image that you present. But what actually happens is, particularly since there are no bank branches in the village, the field level, we have a point of sale machine I just talked about that take thumb impressions, but the money is routed through a number of different institutions, banks, nodal banks with different levels. They work with private contractors who have their own hierarchy. As a result, we do have intermediaries who are a combination of public and private. So despite the appearance of workers or citizens showing up to a computer terminal or a POS machine giving the thumb impressions, the money travels through a bunch of different layers of intermediaries. So the intermediaries exist, even if the rhetoric about direct benefit transfers or cash transfers continue to kind of propagate that there are no intermediaries. Here I'm just going to argue that there is intermediaries present at every level. The next big claim and the attraction for using digital technology here is that digital payments are instantaneous. But we did an analysis based on publicly available data sources, and combined with our field presence, which kind of goes beyond what is published in the official website, is that the average delay was 15 and a half days to process the payments. This is just to process the payment. This is not the actual payments of receiving to the workers. The payments were 43.6 days approximately on average delay that people got. We should obviously add the caveat, this is just data from one mandal, because we couldn't ascertain the fact that how many people actually got it. We could do it by our field presence in one mandal where we know that the delay was significantly more than what the website said. And also the point to note here is that the governments are tracking the payments at different stages. The program does stipulate penalties for late payments, which is laudable because it's unheard of in many other programs where the fact that you're not getting paid, if you get paid late, the government is supposed to give penalties, and not surprisingly, that has actually never happened. But it is an indicator that these payments are not immediate, despite the move to digital payments. And these payments are not instantaneous because of various reasons that we're not actually discussing in this paper. But the point I want to make is these reasons are completely opaque to the end user. And even for a technology team that we're trying to kind of figure out where the payment was stuck, it was extremely hard to figure out. The next claim is whether this technology in general has prevented corruption. We find obviously that this is not a universal point. And observations, we heard a lot of anecdotes about strategies to subvert these technologies, like issuing partial payments. So if you work for multiple different days, what they would do is to combine the work and then issue payments only for the work for one particular set of days. They would fudge the machine, which would reveal which would give them a printout, and they would say printer is not available, and would basically give out whatever payments they want to give. And also there's another tactic which we saw was delaying payments so much so that introducing a shock into the system where they are so worried about getting the payments, and what they would do is to kind of negotiate a partial payment for instant cash. The point here is to simply show the problems persist despite the shift to digital payments, and should not be news to this community, but I just want to kind of make sure that this is something that we see constantly. So this is going back to Sylvia's work, which she did a paper, and we actually find the same result. And our original question, which is still actually continuing, which is the motivation for doing this project, was to answer a very simple set of questions. From the point of view of the individuals who are actually receiving this payment, we want to know how much money should each person should receive. Have they been paid that amount? Where is the money stuck? And these are simple questions. But if you go to the website, there are 220 reports, and hence we need software developers to figure this out for us to kind of build this citizen dashboard that we can now use phones to send out. So these reports, obviously, understandably, are often at the aggregate level, because this is really meant for the bureaucrats and for their purposes. So, but if you're interested in actually building transparency for facing workers, that work has to be done by us or by somebody else. And this is if there's one takeaway for the policy folks who are interested, is that one of the fallouts we observed was these intermediaries are often private, and they're not required to release information about their process, about what happens. They're not governed by the right to information laws that, and the right to information law only cover public entities. So these systems remain opaque. So what we are essentially asking for is that these systems, even if they include private intermediaries, should be under the right of information law, because it is talking about public systems, public accounts, and still, as today, that is no way close to happening. And I also want to point out that this is a case that showed, hopefully, that in this context, direct disintermediate cash transfers is still far away. This doesn't mean that we can't do direct cash transfers, but we can't use this example, which they are claiming as an evidence to support how direct cash transfers is working. Here we're showing that there is this direct cash transfers is really was not direct in the case in the other case. And technology clearly does not disintermediate. You saw a lot of new players being created. And to repeat that point, which is that we need to have more regulation and have private intermediaries to be regulated under the right to information law. With that, thank you. And please, again, check the website out. and we're looking for software developers to help us with the with this project. Thank you.
Got one over there. So thank you. I was wondering if you, in your work or in literature, there is any comparison data, benchmark, like baseline comparison data. So you said that with direct cash transfers, there is a delay of 43.5 days. Compared to what? I mean, what was the delay before we got into direct transfer?
It's a good question. I think we're not saying that. I mean, first of all, we don't have the data to say whether comparing, because that's not this is just one bundle, right? And so this is not an aggregate figure in any way. So the point here was to just make it clear that the instantaneous idea payments through technology is not happening. It's just to kind of get that fact that it is 43 days after having worked in NREGA, you receive your payments. Is information enough? You don't need to compare it with. I mean, you could compare it with other things, but the point is just that it stands on its own. That it's significant delay. Yeah.
So this is very informative and educative, and as you know, we end up fighting with a lot of these intermediaries when the money is not reaching my neighbors. And what I want to know is, in all this process of research and discussion, did you have any reflections on, so what would be a better system? How would we find a better way of getting the money out to the people whose money we are holding back?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that's why I was saying even in the paper focuses on the negative aspect of life. And even this project, but if you take an assessment in general about NREGA, for example, in Andhra, you average it out, not focus on this one case that you find out. I do think that I spend a lot more time in my forthcoming book on this question of how does technology actually help in this process of, does it help in speeding payments and solving some of these problems? And the answer I find is it does if it is continuously patched. And these problems that you find, if bureaucrats are actually continuously interested in figuring out why it fails and then fixing them all continuously, then it seems to kind of work. So I guess the point being, introducing technology does not just magically work. It creates all sorts of new problems. So one answer, if you want to still use technology, you have to continuously fix it. But this is not the only way. In Tamil Nadu, for example, there's no technology at all. The way they solve the problem is actually have a local meeting where the local sarpanch or the panchayat leader essentially hands out cash. And the reason why it works there, it's not in the technology. It's because because of mobilization that happened through many decades of groups. They are in a position to demand their rights. And I mean, I just wanted to kind of take this point about demonetization and all the excitement, all the frustration. Myself was, I was visiting that time. I was very frustrated by lack of cash and the pressure that we all put on the system for not be able to kind of take cash is something that people need to do in the poor, where they are mobilized. They're able to put that pressure on the system and they react, right? So I think the long-term answer, unfortunately, is all these technical systems can only help us so much. It really depends on the group that is able to put that pressure, because these are very simple things. You work for a land, you need to get paid. It's not really hard to see, and the reason why they're getting away with it is because these people are not mobilized, or people are not so disempowered that they are not able to ask that question. But so the answer is, I guess it's a cop-out answer that we need more social movements and groups fighting for these rights and have a better society than we have.
We have one last question. It's a quick one. Yes.
It's good kind of an analysis, and thank you for that. But somehow I feel that because you have taken data from only one mandal, so it is not clearly reflecting the situation entirely in India. Because you are saying that it's a situation, whatever is happening in India, prevailing in India. Because I know that this kind of direct transfer is happening very efficiently in our country at this moment.
Where?
This direct transfer kind of a thing, money transfer kind of a thing to the target beneficiary is happening very efficiently in India. In many of the things, for example, I am from Orissa, and basically my work mostly in Orissa, based in Orissa, and there I have seen like even direct transfer has happened within 7 days. So this is the recent trend. So this is just a suggestion. If you can broaden your study or this kind of analysis, and also see where this kind of mechanism is working efficiently also, so that there will be a good kind of a comparison, and people can have a right perspective of how this system is happening.
No, I think it's a good point. I think I don't mean to suggest, in fact, I try to add caveats that this is to kind of, it's a very rhetorical strategy to kind of deflate an existing dominant narrative that uses this particular case to make the case for replacing welfare schemes with cash transfers. And it was a very polemic paper.
It's good, yeah.
It was written to show that, hey, here's a case that doesn't, you can't just take this case to make this point, because all these intermediaries are, but I think if one has to kind of assess in general, then you have to do that kind of work. But this was written for a very, very political purpose to make the point that direct cash transfers are not direct. Always. But thanks.
All right, let's thank Rajesh Varaghavan one more time. And our last paper in the session will be presented by Priyank Chandra. His paper is entitled Taming the Amazon, the Domestication of Online Shopping in Bangalore, India. Hey, guys, if you guys are concerned about the open sessions, they will not start until we're done here, so no worries. Cool your jets.
Cool, thank you. Thanks. Hi, so in this talk I will be examining the high-profile entry of online shopping in India, and I'll outline the ways it has either integrated itself or failed to integrate itself to everyday shopping practices. Sure. Yeah, is this more audible? All right. So yeah, so in this talk, I'll examine the high-profile entry of online shopping in India, and I'll outline the ways it has either integrated itself or failed to integrate itself to everyday shopping practices. Now, the majority of shopping in India or in the global south happens in traditional marketplaces that dot the urban landscapes. These marketplaces shape consumption by playing an important role in how buyers interact with goods and services. So most of these traditional marketplaces are organic and are driven by local economic actors responding to consumer demands. As such, they encode rich local knowledge and are an important part of the social economic life of many communities. In recent times, you have capital-intensive corporations such as Walmart, Amazon, who are looking to displace these marketplaces and tap into India's multi-billion-dollar retail market. Now, in contrast to Western markets, they have to contend with very different infrastructural, logistical, and cultural issues. For example, while much of the global north e-commerce could piggyback on existing infrastructures such as banking, logistics, and a brand retail ecosystem, In India, they have had to establish all this bottom up. However, in recent times, they have been helped by Indian government's digitization efforts, such as Digital India. For example, e-commerce openly supported the 2016 demonetization move looking to push forward a cashless economy. In the process, the adoption and use of e-commerce has become intertwined with narratives of development and modernity. Multiple international development agencies have outlined how e-commerce can be harnessed by policymakers to support economic growth and development. So our study positions the entry of online shopping in India against this backdrop of techno-utopian optimism, where digital literacy and use of digital services, such as e-commerce, are equated with empowerment, development, and modernity, and the non-use of digital services is looked at as a proxy for social exclusion. So now entrenched practices and infrastructural and institutional forces have led to active non-use of online shopping in India, with many shoppers still choosing to buy in traditional marketplaces. To focus our attention on how online shopping still has not incorporated itself to everyday life, we explicitly study non-use. However, many of the existing technology adoption models do not consider non-use as a voluntary and informed decision. For example, the technology diffusion model discusses the mechanism through which knowledge of technology use spreads in society. Here, the model treats non-users, or laggards as they're called, as potential future users who need to only be convinced of the benefits of using a new technology. Similarly, the TAM, or the technology acceptance models, which uses social psychological theories of decision-making to look at how users form perception of technologies, privileges use and treats non-use of a technology as problematic. Now, both the technology acceptance and diffusion models are technologically deterministic, and they privilege technology over user agency, and they fail to account for the wider social processes that shape use and non-use, along with the evolution of technologies themselves. In contrast, our paper uses domestication theory, which largely focuses on how users either integrate or conversely fail to integrate a technology with the everyday practices of daily life. Now, Wyatt, in her work on non-use, constructed a typology to capture the spectrum of non-use. We have the resistors who have never used a technology because they don't want to. We have the rejectors who no longer use a technology but had in the past. The excluded who have never used a technology because they lack access to it, and the expelled who involuntarily stop using a technology because of institutional or infrastructural reasons. Now, increased ICT use in countries such as India has meant that actual access to digital services is not as much of an issue as the specific reasons to why they're not being used. In this study, we analyze the conditions that lead the first two groups, that's the rejectors and the resistors, exerting individual agency and voluntarily choosing to not use online shopping. To do so, we interviewed shoppers who continue to visit traditional marketplaces in Bangalore, India. We conducted a total of 73 interviews across 3 marketplaces from May to December 2017. For the interviews, we approached shoppers while they were navigating the marketplaces. This allowed the interviews to not be disruptive to the shopping routines. We initially began our study at SP Road, and as the gender shoppers here were skewed male, we conducted a further round of interviews in other marketplaces in Bangalore. So from this data, we analyzed how online shopping was being domesticated or becoming a part of the everyday lives of shoppers. So domestication theory largely has 4 phases. So we have the appropriation phase, where users are introduced to a technology. We have the objectification phase, where a technology situates itself in a domestic setting. We have the incorporation phase, where the technology integrates itself into everyday practices and infrastructures. And finally, the conversion phase, where user perceptions feed back into the redesign of a technology. So let me now delve deeper into each of these phases. So in the appropriation phase, we looked at how users are introduced to online shopping and the reasons they decide to try it out. Now, the entry of e-commerce in India has been accompanied by large-scale advertising and marketing campaigns, both online and offline. Our studies showed that for many respondents, these advertisements play a key role in influencing the decision to shop online. The strategies of e-commerce companies also have largely revolved around the construct of a price-sensitive customer. As you see in the following quote, discounts on branded items are an important reason to shop online. Do you buy items online? Yes, I do. Like what? Mostly branded things. Any electronics which is branded and standard, I buy it online, especially if there's a lot of discounts. Right now, there are a lot of discounts coming out. So indeed, e-commerce firms have been heavily competing to offer cutthroat prices, in the process sustaining heavy losses as they attempt to transition price-conscious customers from offline to online. Now, in the objectification phase, we look at how online shopping situates itself in a domestic setting and its symbolic meaning. So in our interviews, we found that online shopping was not equally used by people in a household. The dynamics of shopping were often influenced by multiple factors, including ownership of digital devices, the use of electronic money, and household relationships, as we see in the following quote. How you tried online? I tell him, if he's shopping, he buys. Do you usually use the internet? Yes, I watch YouTube and all on it, Facebooking. But shopping online, he has a card, so he buys. But you don't always need cards to shop, right? What about cash on delivery? What? It's possible to pay by cash when you buy online. Yes, I know, that also he does. Some of the female shoppers deferred to their husbands when it came to shopping online because men were perceived to be the primary decision makers when it came to technology-related decisions. With online shopping was perceived to be less about shopping and more about the technology. This was visible even when women owned and used ICT such as mobile phones and were familiar with the use of digital services. Further, online shopping was perceived to be boring, and this was especially true with respect to female shoppers and elderly, for whom shopping was an opportunity to leave the house. We see this in the following quote. I like going out. All day, you're in the house. Going to the markets is nice. Today also, we went shopping. Where? To Gandhi Bazaar. What do you buy? Household stuff. Going to markets, it feels good. So many shops and people, you can eat also. Online, a little boring when you compare. So, however, even though it might not be regarded as equally entertaining, respondents did acknowledge that online shopping was very convenient. And this brings us to the phase of incorporation, which looks at how online shopping has, or in some cases, not integrated itself to existing practices and infrastructures. So, while the growth of Bangalore city over the last 2 decades has led to an increase in disposable income, it has also strained the city's limited infrastructure. And it presents a very important challenge for locals looking to navigate city life, as we can see in this quote. Bangalore has really changed. The traffic situation is so bad that we are forced to stay in one area. Before we could easily travel here quickly and pick something up. Now we think twice because it takes time to come. So shopping online has emerged as a way for some respondents to purchase goods without having to deal with the hassle of navigating heavy traffic. This was especially true for respondents who stayed at the outskirts of the city without access to marketplaces. However, despite the inconvenience and traffic, some buyers do travel to physical marketplaces because they offer products and services that are unavailable online, specifically the purchase of unbranded goods and out-of-warranty services. Unbranded goods make up an important proportion of sales in traditional marketplaces, and online marketplaces have not been conducive to the sale of unbranded goods, partly because of issues related to copyright, patent, and trademark infringements. Similarly, informal out-of-warranty of repair services are only available in traditional marketplaces. Finally, we look at the phase of conversion, where the perceptions of online shopping influence the process of design. Early on, e-commerce companies faced significant barriers bringing customers on board who are not familiar with online shopping or electronic payments. As you see in this, to combat the lack of comfort and familiarity with electronic payments, most e-commerce companies introduced COD or cash on delivery, which in 2016 represented about 85% of almost all online purchases in India. So in this code, we see the importance of COD. So which do you prefer, COD or card? It depends. If it's a small amount, I prefer COD. Big amount, I might do it through a card. And why is that? I don't like using my card online. I'm not comfortable doing so. So why use it for small amounts? Thus, through providing buyers with a more familiar payment alternative, online marketplaces have been able to integrate themselves with the purchasing practices of some buyers. Now, the journey of moving shopping from offline to online has come a full circle, with many marketplaces now contemplating opening physical stores or offline experience zones, so people can buy the goods they wish to buy in person. The importance of material tangibility has been a key, apologize for that. The importance of material tangibility in shopping has been a key criticism of online shopping. And the decision of e-commerce to set up offline location to experience goods is evidence of how non-use often feeds back into the decisions of e-commerce companies. Now, unlike other technology adoption models, the domestication theory, the phases here are not linear, and the process is not a closed one. So it does not end with the technology simply being adopted. The phase of conversion, where users and non-users communicate their preferences back to the designers, often give feedback that helps them iterate on the product. So in this case, we see the case of experience zones or cash on delivery. Now, I'll discuss some implications that we have for ICT researchers. So our study stresses that we need to move. Okay, our study stresses that we need to move away from studying access to instead looking at a spectrum of use and non-use scenarios. With ownership of mobile phones increasing rapidly, actual access to digital services is not as much of an issue as whether they're being used in everyday life and to what extent. The success of any new technology, design, or policy intervention is contingent on its ability to integrate itself into existing practices. Without romanticizing traditional marketplaces, the current transition to digital also provides an opportunity for researchers to create bottom-up approaches towards the distribution of goods and services in the global south that can integrate itself into existing practices without leading to increased marginalization or exclusion. Finally, technologies are often designed with an idealized user in mind who domesticate them. Currently, there are preconceived notions about the consumer's chiefly price sensitivity and the need for ease of use that are shaping business decisions and also the ultimate design. However, such approaches ignore the powerful social forces that shape use and non-use. Our work stresses that on the need to look at broader web of relationships, infrastructures, institutions to truly understand why a wild digital technology service has not been tamed and become a part of everyday life. And with that, I will take any questions.
So I'm from Bangalore. I'm very familiar with the SP Road Kia market.
Sure.
So you have referred it, the people from Bangalore, they call it markets. And you are referring it to it as marketplaces. So do you have a distinction between markets and marketplaces? Generally, from what I understand, Amazon is an online marketplace. So what is the distinction you're having between markets and marketplaces, and do you think you've used it interchangeably? And
Sure. So in this case, I'm referring to as marketplaces because I'm looking at a specific space where buyers and sellers are meeting. So markets are more abstract, right? I mean, as economists, you refer to markets in any kind of interaction between. But here we are looking at specific spaces where people meet at specific times and locations. So I'm specifically looking at physical marketplaces over here. So I'm looking at SP Road or Commercial Street and comparing that with an online marketplace, which is like an online space where buyers and sellers meet. Yeah.
I mean, they're markets, right? They're simple markets. So
True.
what's the distinction?
I think I'm trying to differentiate between a more abstract notion of the market, which is how economists usually refer to markets as. I think in this specific context, I could use them interchangeably also. You're right about that, yeah. Cool. There is, yeah, I agree. Yes.
So thank you for a nice presentation. I wonder if you came across some of the work that we had done, my student Devanuj and myself, we had done on technology adoption model for what we call emergent users in India.
So you're calling what?
We call it user usage model of technology adoption by emergent users of technology in India. Okay, right. So it's a paper, I can send it to you.
Sure.
So one of the things that we focused on in our work was to understand how different users adopt different technologies, like based on their abilities and things like age, education, income groups, whether you are urban or rural, whether you're, how much exposed you have been to technology, how much need do you have. So different people will have will rank differently on these scales, and then that will affect their technology adoption.
Sure.
And one of the things that we were looking at. So the question is, did you see any, people have maybe very similar attitudes, but maybe because their age is different or because their educational background is different, they were either using or not using their technology, particularly in the context of e-commerce, because e-commerce actually in a sense is one of the in our model at least, is one of the hardest things to adopt because there's monetary transactions involved and so on.
Sure.
So did you see any difference in people?
So yeah, So I think there's a kind of misconception that I noticed that I had before I went to the field, where we assume that the ones who aren't going online for shopping are usually not tech savvy. And what I found out was people were tech savvy. They could use it if they wanted to use it, but they often would choose not to use it. So I did notice a lot of the elderly people who would say, well, my children handle it for me, even though they used online, they went online for other services. So I think there's this kind of notion, this idea of how they prefer to leave their house to go shop online because they were retired, many of them. This was their way of going out to like actually have a social life. So the reasons for adopting or not adopting online shopping here was not because they could not do so, or because of other reasons that there were besides just the actual digital interface itself with online shopping. Yeah.
Okay, we got one last question over there.
Hi, so that was a very interesting. Hi, so that was a very interesting presentation. I want to say that you pointed out people are reluctant to going to the e-commerce platforms because there are certain things that are not available online that are available in the local markets.
Sure.
But there are a very wide classes of there is a very wide class of things that are actually available online. There are many such services. In fact, online you can compare a vendor sitting in Mumbai to a vendor sitting in Odisha. So, what are your views on that, and why do you think that is not sufficient to incentivize people to adopt to e-commerce industry? Apart from that, one more thing, like the online e-commerce industry also offers massive discounts, like Flipkart offers these big billion days. So why are such offers not incentivizing the people?
Right. So, with respect to the first question, we were focusing on users people who were still shopping on traditional marketplaces. So, for me to study what you're talking about, I would have to go to online, see why they're choosing online over traditional marketplace. So here, the specific services they were looking for example, if you wanted to repair an out-of-warranty phone, you went to, in this case, SP Road in Bangalore to do so. So, this service was not available online, but I agree with you. There could be some services which are available online, but they would not have appeared in my sampling pool for sure. The second question, you're right. Discounts are actually in our case are the biggest reason why people are shopping online. They have however. The question here was, despite the fact that you might get cheaper products online, why would you still go to traditional marketplaces then? And I guess here the case was, there were other things they got there. For example, they had relationships that were built in these marketplaces. They would often go there because they had to buy unbranded goods, which could not be bought online. So no matter how cheap Flipkart might be, you still have unbranded goods which are not available there. Like if you want a Chinese knockoff phone, you would go to these kind of markets, right? If you want to buy yourself a cheap salwar, instead of going to Flipkart and buying that, you would go over here. So that's the reason why they were choosing to come to these places, yeah.
All right, so let's thank Priyank one more time.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, just a couple of announcements. Just reinforcing that the European Union, the impact of the European Union GDPR open session has been canceled, and the open session on intersectional computing will be at the lunch area. All right.
project एक मिनट बंद करते